today we're going to be looking at the DRC case study. This case study forms part of the dynamic development topic. What you're going to do today is you're going to know a range of human and physical factors that have hindered the DRC's development. You will then be able to explain how successful the DRC has been at meeting the Millennium Development Goals. And then finally, we will evaluate the success of TNCs and development projects in enhancing development in the DRC. So where is the DRC located? As you can see from the maps on the right hand side, the DRC is located in Central Africa and has 9 neighbouring countries that surround it. The capital city of the DRC is Kinshasa, and as you can see from both maps, the DRC is mostly landlocked. However, it does have very small amount of access to the coast. The DRC is currently in stage 2 of the Rostal model, which is referred to as preconditions for takeoff. The DRC is struggling, however, to move into stage 3, which would involve rapid industrialization and increasing wealth, and one of the main reasons for this is poor infrastructure. For example, only 10% of the population have access to electricity. So what we're going to do now is we're going to think about some of the things that have hindered the DRC's development historically and still to present day. In terms of human factors that have hindered development, if you look to the left-hand side of the table, we can see that colonialism is one. The DRC under Belgian rule from 1885 to 1960 hindered the country massively. Wealth left the country and people only had access to a very basic education under Belgian rule. Corruption. So Mobutu allowed armed forces to loot the country and also took bribes from large companies so that they could gain access to resources. And conflict as well. The DRC has a long history of political and social unrest, and this has caused damage to crops and infrastructure as well. In terms of physical factors, these natural factors that have hindered development, the size of the country is one. The DRC has is a very large country and has quite a sparse population, which means that goods have to be transported thousands of miles, and also it's very expensive to invest in infrastructure. As mentioned previously, the DRC has just a very small amount of coastline, and this limits ocean transport and trade. Building roads and railways is difficult and expensive, especially because most of the country is covered in forest. And finally, the climate is a factor as well. The climate makes food production difficult in the DRC because they have a long dry season, but also they get droughts in many parts of the year. Frequent floods can ruin crops as well as destroying settlements and infrastructure. Over the next couple of slides, we're going to think about how successful the DRC has been at meeting the Millennium Development Goals. Now, the Millennium Development Goals were 8 international development goals for the year 2015 that have been established following the Millennium Summit of the UN in 2000. So on the screen, you'll see that I've highlighted 3 particular Millennium Development Goals that have been relatively, but not completely, successful. MDG 2, which was to achieve universal primary education, is relatively successful. The percentage of children who completed a primary school education increased from 35% in 1999 to 72% in 2013, so it more than doubled. MDG 6 has also been relatively successful. The aim was to combat HIV, AIDS, malaria and other diseases. And as you can see, the percentage of people with HIV/AIDS decreased from 5% to 1%, and the proportion of people with malaria halved over this period. The final goal that I've highlighted as being successful is Millennium Development Goal 8, which is basically to try and increase trade links between countries. And the DRC has been very successful in this. It has increased its trade links with China in particular, with China having invested £6 billion in infrastructure. However, this is in return for access to mineral resources. As mentioned on the previous slide, some of the goals have been relatively successful. However, on this slide I have highlighted 2 goals which have been less successful. The first one is Millennium Development Goal 1, eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Now, the percentage of people in poverty did decrease between 2005 to 2012. However, this was by just 8%. There is still 63% of people in the DRC living in poverty. Also, what's quite striking is the number of people who are suffering from malnutrition in the country actually increased from 51% in 2000 to 66% in 2015, and therefore we could argue that this goal has not been met. The next Millennium Development Goal, which I would argue has not been as successful, is Millennium Development Goal 3, which was the aim to promote gender equality and empower women. Now, the percentage of girls finishing primary school doubled, which is obviously great. However, the percentage of boys finishing grew more over the same period, and therefore inequality has actually increased. The gap between boys and girls has grown. There are also fewer women than men in paid work, and on average they earn less for doing the same job. We're now going to think about the success of a top-down and a bottom-up development strategy in the DRC. Now remember that top-down development strategies are these large-scale development strategies that tend to be government-led and often tend to be more expensive, whereas bottom-up development strategies are less expensive and often run by local communities or charities. So in terms of the top-down development strategy we're going to learn about, it's the Grand Inga Dam. Now the Grand Inga Dam was a large-scale construction project which cost $80 billion, and some of the donors for this project were World Bank, African Development Bank and others, China being one. Now the advantages of this project is that it could provide cheap clean energy, which is vitally needed, seeing as only 10% of the country have access to electricity at the moment. It will also promote industry in the DRC and provide jobs and boost the local economy. Disadvantages, however, are there's a huge risk that some money may be lost due to corruption. Little provision has been made for transmitting energy to poor rural communities, and therefore the gap between rural locations in the DRC and urban areas could widen, and also the flooding of the Bundi Valley has meant that 30,000 people have been relocated. The next strategy we're going to look at is this bottom-up development strategy. Now remember that bottom-up development strategies tend to be on a smaller scale, tend to be run by local communities and charities. Now Comic Relief therefore has donated money to try and improve education in the DRC, and they've done that by involving teachers, students and parents in improving rural schools. The advantages of this particular project is that local people have had a say in how their schools should be improved and therefore have been empowered by the project, and also better educated people earn more money and therefore they contribute more to the economic development of the country. Disadvantages, however, is that there's not enough funding to improve all schools, so again there may be widening inequality between rural areas on this occasion. Some families also need children to earn a living, so they can't actually afford to send them to school. And this, as we mentioned previously, is a small-scale project. It's not a large-scale solution. We will now consider the role that Orange, a transnational corporation, has had on the country. Now remember, transnational corporations or companies are companies that operate in numerous countries around the world. So Orange are a good example of this because they operate in 33 different countries across the world, and most recently have started operating in the DRC. So some background: Orange has invested 95 million in developing its mobile network. As a result, they've opened 22 stores, provided 18,000 hours worth of training to staff, and as a result have employed 600 people in the process. Being a telecommunications company, they have also provided 3G internet data access to people in the country. And if we're thinking about how that's benefited people's quality of life, having access to 3G internet data is going to help businesses and trade. So how has this supported the DRC? What has been successful? Well, they've also, alongside opening up these branches, they've invested 500,000 into community projects. So they have been doing things like providing ICT education, health and agricultural training to local people. They've also invested in ICT programs to support school children, and they've also sponsored a hospital ward to support victims of sexual violence, and will also help pregnant women receive medical help until they give birth. So we can make a link here between this and the Millennium Development Goals and gender equality. They've also teamed up with Oxfam to support women farmers. Now, in terms of the limitations or potential disadvantages, it's just worth noticing that transnational corporations are footloose, and that means that they can leave the country at any moment. There is no obligation for them to stay there. They also are predominantly operating in urban areas, in particular in the capital, Kinshasa, and therefore the gap in development between rural and urban areas could grow as a result of this. Another problem in general with TNCs is that the profits often return to the country where the headquarters is based, on this particular occasion, this being France. And also, Orange is a business, okay, and they are fundamentally there to make a profit. And one of the reasons they are operating in the DRC is because they pay less taxes here than they would in other places around the world. So that brings the end of this revision session on the DRC. What I suggest you do now is attempt these 3 practice questions on the screen.